The captain's fingers hovered just long enough over the boarding pass for the message to be unmistakable. Contempt dressed as authority. "First class, sweetheart?" he said, voice dipped in condescension, eyes flicking to the skin on her hand. "You must be lost." He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His words, precise and performed, slid like frost across the hush of the first-class cabin, where polished shoes rested on footrests and soft champagne bubbled in untouched flutes. All eyes lifted, not in alarm but in casual curiosity, like museum-goers inspecting an unfamiliar painting out of place in a familiar gallery. Nia Carter, 17, barely turned her head. Her hands, always so steady in debate competitions, trembled just slightly now, gripping the strap of her leather portfolio. Inside it she carried the argument that had won her the California State Invitational, the one that had earned her a seat at the International Youth Oratory Forum in London. But none of that mattered here. She was not Nia the finalist, the scholarship recipient, the disciplined, precise voice that could eviscerate a tax loophole or build a foreign policy countermodel from scratch. She was simply Nia, a black girl in the wrong seat, in the wrong cabin, in the wrong eyes. The pilot didn't ask to see her boarding pass. He reached out and took it, with the air of a man removing something suspicious from an expensive table. "Name?" he said, flipping the ticket over without waiting. "No." "Never mind." A soft, involuntary laugh from seat 3C. A cough meant to cover it in 3D. Somewhere, a phone screen lit up discreetly. A quiet tap-tap of someone filming. Documentation or entertainment. Nia couldn't tell. "Look," the captain said, lowering his voice just enough to make it more dangerous. "This section is for our premium guests, not promotional stunts." Nia looked at him then, fully. Her eyes, the color of burnt mahogany, met his pale, practiced smirk, and for a second, a sharp, narrow second, there was silence. Not the kind that comforts, the kind that accuses. She could have said her name. She could have explained that her ticket had been booked months ago under a corporate code that even the ground staff didn't fully understand. She could have mentioned the initials EC and watched his face change, but she didn't. Because she had done that once before, in a hotel lobby in Atlanta, and the memory still tasted bitter. Instead, she did what her mother had taught her. She stayed still, not small. She breathed through her nose, nodded once, and stood up without speaking, as if the humiliation were a coat she could shrug off. The captain pocketed the pass with the satisfaction of a man finishing a chore. "Follow me," he said. She did. Behind her, the luxury cabin exhaled its judgment. Soft leather whispered as passengers shifted in their seats. The air carried no outrage, only the clinical silence of compliance. But what Captain Rick Holtz didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the girl he had just escorted out of first class had never needed the seat to prove she belonged. Because she didn't inherit a seat. She inherited the whole damn airline. The galley was narrow and cold, as though it resented being used for anything more than coffee preparation and whispered crew conversations. Nia stood with her back to the metal counter, the hum of the refrigeration unit echoing in her ears louder than her own breath. No one had touched her, not physically. But there are other kinds of touch, the kind that lingers invisible on skin, etched in silence, the kind that announces to everyone, she doesn't belong, without needing to say a word. The junior flight attendant who stood near her offered a smile, tight-lipped and fluttering with discomfort, like a napkin caught in wind. "Just a routine check," she said, voice barely audible over the clatter of trays. "Sometimes the system misflags special bookings." Nia said nothing. She had learned over years of being the only one in many rooms how words could betray dignity, how explaining could shrink you more than silence. Meanwhile, the cabin door to first class closed with a soft click. It might as well have been a vault. She could hear them in there, the rustle of newspapers, the shifting of luxury blankets, the tin clink of ice and crystal, the sounds of comfort continuing uninterrupted, untouched by what had just happened. And then there was Grace Monroe. Senior Attendant Grace had watched it unfold from the service alley, her body still but her eyes sharp. Not the sharpness of accusation, no, the sharpness of quiet calculation. She had seen enough in her 27 years in the sky to know when a line had been crossed, and by whom. Grace didn't confront Captain Holton, not yet. That was not her way. She believed in paperwork before protest, evidence before escalation. But her fingers moved quickly, almost absently, across her in-cabin tablet. She pulled up the manifest, tapped into the restricted code section, and there it was. Passenger, Carter, Nia. Seat 2A. Booking code, ECSKY1. Flagged. VIP override priority status. Grace didn't blink. She didn't gasp. She simply pressed Save to internal log and turned the screen off. "Miss Carter," she said finally, her voice like silk wrapped around a scalpel. "Would you like a glass of water while we wait?" Nia looked up, unsure whether to accept kindness that might dissolve her resolve. "I'm okay," she said, though her throat burned with the acid of unspoken words. Grace nodded, not pressing. "Let me know if that changes." The galley door opened briefly. Captain Holtz peered in. He didn't speak to Nia, didn't look at her, only addressed Grace. "Let me know when the verification clears. If there's any issue, she'll need to be seated elsewhere." And then he was gone again. Grace didn't move for several seconds. The metal door closed behind him with the finality of a courtroom gavel. Nia reached into her bag and retrieved her phone, her fingers trembling slightly. Not from fear. She didn't fear him. But from the familiar sting of being judged, not by your name or purpose, but by the tint of your skin and the cut of your silence. She opened her recent calls. One name sat pinned at the top. Dad, private line. She didn't call. Not yet. Instead, she typed, "Something's happening again, like before." She hit send and waited. The reply came 7 minutes later. Not a call, not a flood of words, but a simple text that read, "Hold your ground. I'm listening from here." No exclamation marks, no reassurance-laced overreaction, just the quiet, steady certainty of a man who had faced storms in boardrooms and worse in life and always returned standing. Nia read the message twice, then slid the phone into her pocket. The air in the galley felt less suffocating now. The silence around her had not softened, but something within her had shifted, as if her spine had remembered its full length. At the forward end of the cabin, Grace Monroe walked to a discreet panel near the beverage station. She keyed in a sequence known only to senior crew, a line not for emergencies but for executive-level discrepancies, the kind that required velvet gloves over iron hands. The voice that answered was calm, male, and clipped. "Sky Atlantic Priority Operations, go ahead. This is Flight 204, Cabin Senior, Passenger Carter, Nia. Seated 2A, code ECSKY1 triggered. There was a delay in processing. We may have a protocol mismatch." There was a pause, a kind of stillness that only comes when someone is trying very hard not to reveal urgency. "Copy. Confirm identity. Manifest scan verified?" "Yes." Another pause. "Monitor quietly. Maintain standard cabin experience. Do not escalate. Will advise." Grace closed the panel. Her face gave away nothing, but her hands moved with more certainty now. She returned to the galley, where Nia stood reading something on her tablet. A speech, most likely. Her lips moved ever so slightly, as if rehearsing in silence. She reminds me of someone, Grace thought. Not someone famous. Someone brave in private. Her own niece, perhaps. Or herself 20 years ago, before the sky taught her which expressions to wear in front of captains. Just then, First Officer Javier Ellis stepped into the galley. He was younger than Holtz, with an engineer's eyes and a priest's quiet. Grace passed him a folded note, the kind that in the wrong context would feel like espionage. He read it, his brows tightened. "Protocol E," he murmured. Grace nodded. "I thought it was retired." "It's not." Ellis didn't ask more. Instead, he returned to the cockpit with the controlled stillness of a man who knew better than to announce a fire before seeing smoke. Inside the control deck, he keyed in the onboard flight operations channel and transmitted a status ping. 2 seconds later, a system ping returned, with a blinking override alert. High VIP flag detected. Alert. AC Preview 1. Confidential contact required. The first officer stared, then looked up slowly at the name again. Nia Carter. And that's when the light began to turn. There is a kind of silence that doesn't simply fill the air. It swells within it, like steam rising quietly before a storm. That was the silence inside the cockpit, when First Officer Ellis placed the flight operations tablet on the central console and let it speak in blinking code. EC Prev 1, full confidential status. Executive hold active. Captain Holtons didn't react immediately. His hands remained steady on his checklist, as if the weight of decades in the sky had taught him to delay expression until facts were confirmed. But his eyes betrayed a flicker, just enough to suggest that somewhere behind all his rank and regulation, something ancient and flawed had been stirred. "Passenger 2A?" he asked, already knowing. "Nia Eleanor Carter," Ellis answered, his voice calm but cool, like a man balancing truth on the edge of professionalism. The name lingered in the air between them, as if carried not by sound but by recognition. "Carter," Holtz repeated, this time softer, almost contemplative, as if testing the name on his tongue to see how bitter it might become. Ellis said nothing more. The moment didn't require elaboration. Outside the cockpit, Grace Monroe was already moving. Not hurried, never hurried, but with the purposeful grace of a woman who had seen enough injustice packaged in manners to recognize when silence became complicity. She checked the tablet once more, saw the updated manifest confirmation, and understood now why the override code had pulsed in red instead of green. It wasn't a random priority. It was a flag so high in the system that only executive command could activate it. She returned to the galley and faced Nia, who sat still, her tablet resting on her knees like a shield made of words. Her expression was composed, but there was a stiffness in the line of her shoulders, the kind that comes from enduring a wound that hasn't yet found permission to hurt. "Miss Carter?" Grace said, and the name sounded different now, like a title returned after theft. "There's been an update regarding your seat. I've been instructed to escort you back to 2A. Nia blinked slowly, her voice measured when she answered. "So, the system finally cleared?" Grace didn't smile. She simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Fully." And as Nia stood, gathered her bag and walked the short but symbolic steps down the aisle, the hush that followed her was not the same one that had accompanied her earlier removal. This silence was tighter, more aware, laced with an unspoken question that hung in the filtered air like an unfinished sentence. Who, exactly, is this girl? She said nothing. She took her seat, unfolded her blanket with the same care as before, and placed her debate notes back into her lap. Around her, the luxury cabin hummed back to life, but the rhythm had changed, subtle but undeniable, like a symphony that had just discovered its wrong note. In the cockpit, Captain Holter stared at the forward instruments but saw nothing. Not the altitude, not the course. Only a name now quietly echoing in his head like a sentence unspoken too late. Captain Holty stood just outside the curtain dividing first class from the galley, his posture rigid with the kind of tension that doesn't come from turbulence but from miscalculation. He watched as Nia Carter sat composedly in seat 2A, the same girl he had moments earlier removed without hesitation or verification, and now, returned by protocol he couldn't override. He didn't approach at first. Instead, he lingered with the hesitation of a man retracing a misstep, trying to determine whether the next one would be redemption or ruin. When he finally stepped forward, it wasn't with humility, but with the brittle formality of someone still grasping at the remnants of authority. "Miss Carter?" he said, voice low, carefully modulated, not warm, not contrite, just controlled. Nia didn't look up immediately. She kept her eyes on the sentence she was rereading for the 5th time, her thumb pressing lightly against the corner of her screen, as if anchoring herself to something objective in a world tilting slightly. "Yes?" she answered, her tone uninflected, as if addressing an announcement rather than a man. "I wanted to personally clarify earlier there was an issue with the manifest. These things happen." She looked up then, not sharply, but with the slow steadiness of someone giving permission to be looked at. And in that gaze there was no aggression, no indignation, only a quiet, almost clinical observation that said, "I'm watching how you choose to shape this moment." "No," she said, her voice softer than expected but unshakable. "That's not what happened." Holtz hesitated. "I was removed without cause, before verification. You didn't ask questions, you made a decision." He opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to protest, but the words didn't come, because he knew, in the way that aging pilots know the exact weight of fuel versus distance, that anything he said now would carry not meaning, but consequence. "I'd prefer not to continue this conversation," she said, and the refusal was not rude. Not even abrupt. It was dignified, contained, the way a courtroom closes a file and not a door. Grace Munro, watching from the galley, took a quiet step forward, her presence an unspoken reminder of boundary. Holtz nodded curtly, more to himself than anyone, and turned back toward the cockpit, his stride measured but no longer confident. The cabin, though outwardly calm, pulsed with the awareness of something significant unspoken. Passengers who had once shifted to better see the confrontation now shifted to avoid eye contact. The man in 3A folded his newspaper with unnecessary precision. The woman in 2D suddenly found interest in the window. Nia turned back to her screen, resumed reading, but her heart beat differently now. Not with fear or even anger, but with the measured rhythm of someone reclaiming her own space, not because it was given, but because it had always been hers. The plane began its slow descent over the gray sprawl of Heathrow, and inside the cabin the mood had shifted from quiet luxury to something more taut, an anticipation not of arrival, but of revelation, though no one would say it aloud. The first-class passengers, well practiced in discretion, sat straighter, sipped slower, their movements deliberate, rehearsed, as if by slowing their breath they could avoid becoming part of something they did not understand. Nia Carter remained in seat 2A, untouched by the hush, her fingers now tracing lines of an argument she no longer needed to rehearse. Her work was done. On the page, and perhaps, too, in the air. The landing itself was smooth. Too smooth, perhaps. The kind that experienced travelers know to distrust because it means the captain had something to prove. As the aircraft rolled to the gate, an unusual announcement came. Not from the crew, but from the cockpit. "We request all first-class passengers remain seated momentarily after arrival due to a ground crew protocol." No one moved, they all knew. When the cabin door finally opened, two figures appeared, not in uniform, but in tailored suits bearing discreet but unmistakable Sky Atlantic credentials. They didn't look around, they didn't speak. They simply nodded once toward Grace, who nodded back, and then one of them stepped into the cockpit with the fluidity of someone who didn't need permission to enter spaces most people never saw. Captain Holtz emerged moments later, not escorted, not handcuffed, but not alone. His eyes were blank, too calm, like a man performing dignity in the absence of control. He did not look toward Nia's seat, he looked forward, past the luxury, past the travelers, toward whatever end waited for men who made the wrong assumptions at the wrong altitude. The security protocol was silent, a man on each side, no words, no physical contact, just presence. And then came the moment that turned rumor into truth. As Holtz stepped into the jet bridge, Nia Carter stood waiting. No entourage, no press, no badge, just presence, tall and measured. The stillness of a man whose anger did not announce itself but arrived with precision. He said nothing at first. He simply stepped into Holtz's path just slightly, enough for the captain to stop, not by force, but by recognition. Mr. Carter looked at the man who had questioned his daughter's place, not with fire, but with the weight of a father who had built empires and understood exactly what kind of man crumbles beneath silence. And then he spoke. "She told me not to make a scene," Elijah said, his voice low, worn smooth by decades of choosing when to speak and when to let the world watch. "So I won't. But know this, your report won't be filed, because your career just ended. Quietly, permanently, and not because of me, but because you still thought you could humiliate a girl like her and walk away." Holtz didn't answer. Couldn't. Not with words. He nodded just once, the kind of nod men give when their last story has been written by someone else. Then he turned and walked into the hallway of corporate oblivion. Back inside the aircraft, Nia sat still, unaware that across terminals boardrooms were shifting. Policies would be rewritten, titles reassigned. But for now, all she did was close her tablet and fold her blanket. The quiet rituals of a girl who had just reclaimed the sky. Captain Rick Holtz sat in the quiet of the debriefing room, not in handcuffs, not disgraced by a spectacle, but bound instead by something colder. The knowledge that no one was coming to speak on his behalf. No union rep had shown up. No familiar face from 30 years of flying had appeared. Just two observers from Sky Atlantic's Executive Integrity Division, both polite, both expressionless, both already certain of the outcome. There were no raised voices, no angry confrontations, just paperwork placed before him with elegant finality and a phrase he would hear repeated 3 times that day, each time with less room to contest. "You are being relieved pending internal review, effective immediately." He signed the forms. The pen didn't tremble, not because he was strong, but because his hand had spent a lifetime steadying metal in the air. It hadn't learned how to tremble yet on the ground. His access badge was deactivated before he left the room. His pilot credentials were flagged on hold by the FAA within hours, a procedural step that didn't mean he was guilty. But no airline would take the risk now. Not when Carter was involved. Not when the internet had begun to whisper. Because somewhere on the flight someone had filmed something. Not the full scene, just a clip. Barely 20 seconds. A black girl being escorted out of first class. The words, "not your section," barely audible under the soft hum of cabin air. It was posted without comment. It didn't need one. The story unfolded in the quiet between frames. The caption read only, "You can hear the moment her silence becomes louder than his authority." Within hours, the clip reached over 500,000 views, then newsrooms. By morning, the name Captain Holtz trended for all the wrong reasons. But none of that mattered more than the message he received the next day at 5:17 a.m. from his wife, Elaine. Short, unsparing, He said it was nothing, but the world just watched it. "I need time." He sat at the edge of the guest bed in a condo they once rented before they bought their house, a place that smelled like dust and endings, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold before he ever tasted it. He thought of the girl again. Not her name, not her father, not even the seat she had returned to, but the way she had looked at him when he approached the second time. That gaze wasn't angry. It wasn't even confrontational. It was worse. It was still. It was the look people give when they've already accepted you no longer matter. And that, he realized, was the thing he had never prepared for. Not turbulence, not technical failures, not even human error. What he could not survive was irrelevance. And now, stripped not by force, but by quiet consequence, he became what every man fears at the end of a long career. Forgotten for the wrong reasons, remembered only for the wrong day. Nia Carter stood on the stage in London, the soft yellow spotlight catching the faint shimmer of the pins in her braided hair, and for a moment, just a moment, the applause around her blurred into something distant, like ocean waves breaking far from shore. She didn't raise the trophy above her head. She held it close to her side, both hands wrapped around its base, as if it were something sacred, not because it was heavy with metal, but because it was heavy with meaning. She had debated 6 rounds over 3 days: migration ethics, artificial intelligence, governance, corporate carbon debt. And with each round, her voice grew stronger, not louder, never louder, but more certain. She spoke not with rage, but with a patience that made people lean in rather than recoil. The kind of patience that comes from being told, "Wait your turn," too many times, and finally deciding to answer not with volume, but with precision. Elijah Carter sat in the 3rd row, flanked by no one. Dressed in a quiet navy suit that drew no attention, but commanded it nonetheless. His phone, always full of market fluctuations and boardroom pings, was turned off for the first time in months. He didn't record the speech. He didn't need to. He had heard it all before, in the rhythm of her mother's hands folding hospital linens, in the way Nia practiced rebuttals to herself while washing dishes, and in the silence she held that day in the plane, when silence said more than any retort could. After the final announcement was made and the applause finally settled into murmurs of dispersing guests, he waited by the side door of the auditorium. When she walked toward him, still holding the trophy as if afraid it might vanish, he didn't speak right away. He opened his arms, and she stepped into them. Not weeping, not breaking, just breathing. "I'm proud of you," he said into her hair. And it wasn't a declaration, but a recognition, as if her victory had not begun that night but long before. On tarmacs, in classrooms, in every moment she chose restraint over retribution. "I didn't mention what happened," she whispered. "I know. I didn't need to." He nodded, pulling back to look at her, his eyes soft but clear. "That's the part that makes you dangerous, you know. You don't need to scream to shift the room." Later that evening, in the quiet of their hotel room, Nia sat by the window, legs curled under her, watching the slow sweep of car lights across the Thames. The trophy sat on the nightstand, catching only ambient light. She didn't take a photo with it, didn't post about it, because this wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about knowing the world could try to place her below, but never outside. And that, she realized, was its own kind of victory. Elijah Carter didn't call a press conference. He didn't issue a dramatic company-wide memo or sit for a primetime interview flanked by legal counsel and PR advisors. Instead, he did what the best leaders do when truth hits home, not loudly, but thoroughly. He returned to his office overlooking the Dallas skyline, where the walls held photographs of aircraft he had once flown and a framed letter his daughter wrote at 9, titled, "Why My Dad Makes the World Fly." The day after the flight, he convened a quiet meeting, not with the board, not with shareholders, but with a team of internal auditors, a human dignity consultant from Columbia Law, and the new head of personnel ethics, a woman who had once been denied an executive role for not quite fitting the brand. He handed them a thin folder, not thick with policy, but pointed in purpose. Inside were 3 sentences. The sky is not neutral. Review everything. Start from the cockpit outward. From there, change came, not with fire, but with focus. A pilot culture audit was launched, anonymous, comprehensive, uncomfortable. They reviewed incident reports not for legality, but for patterns of dismissal and delay. Crew training manuals were rewritten, not to include more bullet points, but to ask better questions. Who do you assume doesn't belong? What does authority feel like in your hands? How does silence become a shield? Elijah introduced a new protocol, Eagle Slate. It required that every employee flagged under executive priority receive both automatic validation and a silent accountability review of how the interaction was handled. Not to protect power, but to prevent its misuse. A Diversity, Equity, and Integrity Council was formed, not ornamental, but operational. Every quarter, its metrics were reviewed alongside safety and fuel efficiency, because he believed culture was as critical to altitude as mechanics. When the board hesitated, afraid of investor backlash or public misinterpretation, he reminded them, not with threats, but with clarity. Reputation is not about never being wrong, he said in a closed-door meeting. It's about who we are after we've been. He refused to frame the change as penance. Instead, it was investment, not in image, but in legacy, because a company, like a family, is judged not by its slogans, but by who it protects when no one is filming. Elijah never mentioned Holtz again, not in speeches, not in policy notes, because consequences, he believed, did not need echo chambers. They needed roots. And in the months that followed, small things shifted, first slowly, then unmistakably. A younger pilot who had stopped applying for captain roles reapplied and got the seat. A passenger complaint about being ignored was escalated and resolved with apology, not dismissal. And once, in the corridor of the main terminal, a janitor stopped Elijah, eyes shy, and said, "Sir, my nephew flies now. Says it feels different up there. Says it feels like he's allowed." Elijah smiled, nodded, and kept walking. Because when the sky changes, you don't announce it, you just fly better. Months later, Nia Carter stood once again in the boarding area of LAX, her suitcase beside her, her coat folded neatly over one arm, and a new kind of stillness in her breath, not the stillness of holding back, but of having arrived at a place where nothing needed proving. The Polaris lounge attendant, the same woman from that long-ago morning, recognized her immediately and greeted her not with surprise, but with the soft kind of deference usually reserved for elders, or legends. "Welcome back, Ms. Carter," she said, eyes kind, posture respectful. "Your seat is ready. Would you like tea before boarding?" Nia smiled, grateful, not grand, and accepted. As she stepped onto the plane, a younger captain stood at the cockpit door. No more than 30, black, his uniform neat but not showy, and when he saw her, he smiled with something more than politeness. "Miss Carter," he said, extending his hand like an offering, "I'm Captain Reese. It's an honor to have you aboard." She shook his hand. Warm, grounded. And he added, "I just wanted you to know, some of us fly today because of what you didn't let pass, quietly." Nia nodded, not because she needed the acknowledgement, but because she knew it wasn't really for her. It was for every girl with the wrong name on the right seat, for every silence that had once swallowed dignity whole. She settled into seat 2A, now familiar but never expected, and looked out the window. The runway stretched ahead like a story waiting to be told. Behind her the doors closed, the cabin hushed, engines hummed with memory. And as the plane lifted into the blue, she let her eyes close, not to sleep, but to carry a moment forward, the way only those who've been tested truly can. Because this wasn't just about a ticket, or a seat, or even a single flight. It was about the quiet revolution that begins when one person refuses to be made small, and another chooses not to walk away from the mirror too quickly. And somewhere, above clouds and consequence, a legacy rewrote itself, not in headlines, but in habits, not in fury, but in flight.